The night the bridge went under, I found out Hannah Price had been sleeping in her car for 2 weeks, and neither one of us said a word about it until the power went out. My name is Ryan Cole. I'm 31, I run field crews for a small estate clearing outfit outside town, and up until that week, Hannah was just the woman who kept the paperwork straight while the rest of us hauled furniture and boarded up windows for a living. We were not friends exactly. We were co-workers who were polite to each other in the break room and said drive safe at the end of a shift and never once talked about anything real. That changed the moment our boss handed us a clipboard and a set of keys to the old Whitfield place and told us to get the final inventory done before the storm rolled in. Should be 4 hours, tops, he said. In and out. He was wrong about that, same as he was wrong about the storm only clipping the county. But I didn't know any of that yet, standing in the gravel lot with my toolbox in one hand and Hannah climbing into the passenger seat of my truck with a duffel bag she said was just in case, like a woman who had learned the hard way not to trust a clear forecast. I noticed the bag. I didn't ask about it. That was my first mistake, and also the first small kindness I did her, though I didn't know it yet. Our office wasn't much to look at, a converted feed store with a hand-painted sign out front, 3 trucks in the lot, and a boss named Wade who ran the whole operation off a clipboard and a bad knee. Hannah had been there almost 2 years by the time I showed up, and in the year since, I'd watched her build a reputation as the person who kept the whole outfit from falling apart on paper even when the crews fell apart in the field. She was sharp with numbers, sharper with people who tried to shortcut her, and about as easy to get close to as a locked gate. I'd asked her to grab coffee exactly once, back in the spring, and she'd smiled the polite smile she handed everybody and said she didn't really do that, which I took at face value and never brought up again. What I didn't know, what nobody in that office knew, was that somewhere in the last 2 months her whole life had come apart quietly enough that she'd managed to keep showing up every morning in pressed clothes with her hair done and her paperwork perfect, like a woman standing on solid ground instead of one who'd been sleeping in the back seat of a sedan with a pillow wedged against the window. I found that out later. That morning, all I knew was that she'd tossed a duffel bag into my truck like it was nothing, and something about the careful way she did it told me it wasn't nothing at all. "You sure you want to be out here this far along?" I asked her as we pulled onto the highway, the sky already turning that heavy, waiting color. "Wade needs the inventory before Friday. I'm not letting a due date in 9 weeks turn me into somebody who doesn't finish her job." She said it fast, a little defensive, the kind of answer a person gives when they've had to give it before. Besides, it's a walkthrough with a clipboard. Not exactly hard labor. Didn't say it was. You were thinking it. I was thinking the weather report sounded worse than Wade let on, I said, which was true, and also easier than telling her what I was actually thinking, which was that she looked like a woman running from something a lot more complicated than a due date. The Whitfield farmhouse sat about 40 minutes out past the last decent stretch of paved road, down a lane lined with fence posts that had given up standing straight years ago. It was a big old 2-story place, white paint gone gray, a wraparound porch with 2 boards missing, and a barn out back that had started leaning the way old barns do when nobody's paid attention to them in a decade. The last owner had died in the spring with no kids and a will nobody could make sense of, and our job was simple. Walk every room, tag what could be sold, box what needed saving, leave the rest for the dumpster crew coming Friday. Hannah stepped out of the truck and looked up at the house like it had personally inconvenienced her. "It's bigger than the photos," she said. "They always are." I grabbed the clipboard from her before she could argue about carrying it herself, which she absolutely tried to do. "You're 7 months pregnant." "I'll carry the clipboard." "I can carry a clipboard, Ryan." "I know you can." "I'd still rather you didn't." She gave me a look that told me exactly what she thought of men who fussed, but she let it go, which surprised me more than the argument would have. I'd worked with Hannah for almost a year by then. Enough time to know she didn't let much go without a fight. We got to work fast, because the sky had that heavy gray color that meant business, and the radio in my truck had already started talking about a storm system moving faster than expected. We were supposed to be done and gone before it hit. That was the plan anyway. The first 2 hours were easy. Bedrooms, a study full of water-stained books, a china cabinet that made Hannah go quiet in the careful way people do around things that belonged to somebody's grandmother. She wrote descriptions in small, neat handwriting, and I hauled boxes to the mudroom, and every so often she'd press one hand flat against her lower back and stretch like the walking was starting to catch up with her. "You good?" I asked the third time I caught her doing it. I'm pregnant, not fragile. Didn't say fragile. Said good. She exhaled through her nose, which with Hannah was as close to an apology as you'd get. I'm good. Back hurts. Comes with the territory. I didn't push. That was one thing I'd learned about her over the year. Push too hard and she closed a door on you. Leave a little space and sometimes she walked through it herself. By the time we got up to the second floor, the wind outside had picked up enough to rattle the old windows in their frames, the same way rain used to rattle my grandfather's kitchen when I was a kid. I checked my phone. 1 bar, flickering. The radio in the truck had said the storm was tracking east, which should have kept it away from us. It didn't. The first hard gust hit around 4 in the afternoon, loud enough that Hannah actually flinched, one hand going flat over her stomach like an instinct older than thinking. I came out of the back bedroom to find her standing at the top of the stairs, staring out a window at a sky that had gone the color of a fresh bruise. That doesn't look like clipping the county, she said. No, I admitted. It does not. We loaded the truck fast after that, boxes we'd already tagged, tools, the clipboard, everything we could carry in 10 minutes flat. I told her to wait on the porch while I checked the low spot on the lane, the little creek crossing that flooded every spring and made half the county curse the men who built the road through there 100 years ago. It wasn't a creek anymore. It was a brown, moving wall of water, already up over the low concrete crossing, carrying branches and something that might have been a fence post downstream fast enough that I stood there a solid 10 seconds just watching it, doing math I didn't like the answer to. I walked back to the porch where Hannah was standing with both arms wrapped around herself against the wind. We're not getting out tonight, I said. Her face didn't do the thing I expected. No panic, no argument. Just a slow, tired kind of resignation, like she'd been half expecting bad news all day and this was just one more piece of it. Okay, she said. Then we go back inside. That was the moment the day stopped being a job and started being something else entirely. The Whitfield house still had most of its furniture, since the estate sale hadn't happened yet, which meant we weren't sleeping on bare floors, at least. There was no power, though. The company that served that stretch of road had cut it weeks earlier once the house went vacant, and the generator in the barn had a dead battery and a fuel gauge sitting on empty. I found candles in a kitchen drawer, half a box of matches, and an old kerosene lamp that still had oil in the bottom of it, which felt like the first stroke of luck we'd had all day. Hannah sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a bottle of water from the truck, watching me light the lamp like she was cataloging it for later. You're better at this than you should be, she said. Grew up without power half the winters I can remember. You learn. Rough childhood. Practical one. I set the lamp between us, and the kitchen filled with that warm, uneven glow that makes everything look older than it is. What about you? You don't seem like the kind of woman who ends up sleeping in her car. Her whole body went still. I watched it happen, the way her shoulders came up half an inch, the way her hand tightened around the water bottle. How do you know about that? I don't, not really. Saw the duffel bag this morning. Saw you flinch when I mentioned it. Figured I'd rather ask straight than pretend I didn't notice. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Outside, the wind threw something against the side of the house hard enough to make us both look toward the window. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the sharp edge it usually carried. 2 weeks, she said. My apartment lease fell through when the building sold, and the guy who's supposed to be helping me figure out the next place decided being a father was a conversation he'd rather not finish having. The baby's father. Is. I don't know what tense to use for a man who left the state. She laughed, but there wasn't much behind it. I've been staying with my sister some nights, my car other nights, and telling everyone at work I'm staying with family because it's shorter than the truth and nobody at that office needs my whole story. I didn't say anything for a second, because there wasn't a fast, clean thing to say to that. You should have told me, I said finally. I've got a spare room. Would have cost you nothing but pretending you liked my cooking. I don't know you well enough to move into your spare room, Ryan. You know me well enough to get trapped in a farmhouse with me during a hurricane, apparently. That got a real laugh out of her, short and surprised, like it had escaped before she could decide whether to allow it. Fair point. We ate cold sandwiches from the cooler I always kept in the truck bed for long job days, and the storm kept building outside, rain coming sideways now, hard enough that it sounded less like weather and more like something with intent. Somewhere around 8, the first branch came down on the barn roof loud enough that Hannah grabbed my forearm without thinking, fingers digging in hard enough to leave a mark. "Just a branch," I said. "Old barn's been falling apart longer than either of us has been alive. It'll hold." "You don't know that." "No," I admitted. "But saying it calm helps more than saying it scared." She let go of my arm slowly, like she was embarrassed by how fast she'd grabbed it, and looked down at the table instead of at me. "Sorry." "Don't be. Storm's loud. Baby's heavy. 2 good reasons to hold on to something." Before the house settled into full dark, my phone found one flickering bar of signal, just long enough for a single text to push through. I almost didn't look at it, figured it was Wade checking whether we'd made it out ahead of the storm. It wasn't. It was Hannah's phone that lit up on the table between us, buzzing once, twice, a name on the screen she clearly recognized because her whole posture changed the second she saw it. "Everything okay?" I asked. She stared at the phone like it might bite her. "It's Derek. The father." "The father," she confirmed, and didn't reach for it. It buzzed a third time, then went still, the signal gone as fast as it had come, the message sitting there unread. She turned the phone face down on the table without a word, and I didn't push, though something in my chest had gone tight and protective in a way that surprised me. "You don't have to explain that to me," I said. "I know. I think I want to anyway." She wrapped both hands around her water glass. "He calls maybe once a month. Long enough to feel guilty, short enough that he never actually says anything useful. Never money, never a plan, just enough to remind me he still exists so I can't fully stop waiting for him to decide to." Sounds exhausting. It is. She let out a breath. The worst part isn't even him. It's that some stupid part of me still checks the phone every time, hoping this is the call where he says he's coming back to actually be somebody's father. I hate that part of myself. "That's not a part to hate," I said. "That's just hope refusing to take the hint. Doesn't make you weak. Makes you human." She looked at me for a long moment in the lamplight, like she was deciding whether I meant it or was just saying the kind thing. Whatever she found in my face seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once, slow, and pushed the phone a little further away from herself, like putting distance between her hand and the thing that kept hurting her. That first night, we didn't sleep much. The house groaned in ways that made both of us go quiet and listen, and twice Hannah got up to pace the length of the kitchen with one hand on her back, breathing slow through something I didn't ask about yet because she hadn't offered it. Around midnight, she finally sat back down across from me, and in the low lamplight, I could see how tired she really was, not just from the day, but from weeks of sleeping somewhere that wasn't a bed. "You can sleep," I told her. "I'll keep the lamp lit. Take the couch in the front room, it's got real cushions. You take it. I'm fine on a kitchen chair." "Hannah, you are 7 months pregnant and you have been sleeping in a car. Take the couch." She looked at me for a long second, like she was deciding whether to argue just to prove she could, then finally stood, slow and careful, one hand braced on the table. "Fine," she said. "But only because I'm tired of fighting you about furniture." I walked her to the front room, made sure the old couch didn't have anything worse than dust hiding in the cushions, and left her a folded blanket from one of the linen boxes we'd tagged earlier that day. When I turned to go, she caught my sleeve. "Ryan." "Yeah. Thank you. For not making today weirder than it already is." "Give it a day or two," I said. "I'm sure I'll manage." That got a small, tired smile out of her, the kind that told me more about the last 2 weeks of her life than any story could have. I went back to the kitchen, propped myself in a chair that was never going to let me sleep right, and listened to the storm try to take the roof off an old house that had clearly survived worse. Morning came gray and reluctant. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle, but when I walked the lane down to the crossing, the water was worse, not better, brown and fast and running a foot deep over pavement that should have been dry. My phone had no bars at all now. I stood there a long minute, doing the math on how long a person could last on cooler sandwiches and canned goods from an old pantry, and didn't love any of the answers I came up with. When I got back to the house, Hannah was in the kitchen going through cabinets with the kind of grim focus I recognized from watching her organize inventory sheets. Found beans, canned soup, some old rice, and a coffee can that's mostly rust, she reported. We're not going to starve. We might get very tired of beans. Crossing's worse, I said. We're here at least through tonight. Maybe tomorrow, too. She set down the can she'd been holding and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not panic. Something closer to calculation. Before either of us said much else, we spent the better part of an hour doing a slower walk through the upstairs rooms we hadn't finished tagging, mostly because it gave us something to do with our hands that wasn't worrying. There was a nursery up there, unused, paint-faded yellow, a crib frame still standing in the corner with no mattress left in it. Hannah stopped in the doorway a long moment, one hand resting on the frame, and I watched something complicated move across her face. Somebody planned for a baby in this house once, she said. And it never happened, or it happened and then this room just got left behind when everybody else moved on with their lives. You don't know that. No, she admitted. But it's hard not to think about it, standing here. You're not leaving anything behind, I said. Whatever else happens with Derek, whatever else happens with any of it. That baby's got a mother who drove out here in a storm instead of calling in sick to a job she didn't have to prove anything to. That's not a story about somebody getting left behind. She didn't answer right away, just ran her thumb along the edge of the crib frame like she was memorizing the shape of it. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were wet, though she blinked it back fast, the way a woman does when she's spent years teaching herself not to let people watch her cry. When I got back to the house, Hannah was in the kitchen going through cabinets with the kind of grim focus I recognized from watching her organize inventory sheets. Found beans, canned soup, some old rice, and a coffee can that's mostly rust, she reported. We're not going to starve. We might get very tired of beans. Crossing's worse, I said. We're here at least through tonight. Maybe tomorrow, too. She set down the can she'd been holding and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not panic. Something closer to calculation. Before either of us said much else, we spent the better part of an hour doing a slower walk through the upstairs rooms we hadn't finished tagging, mostly because it gave us something to do with our hands that wasn't worrying. There was a nursery up there, unused, paint-faded yellow, a crib frame still standing in the corner with no mattress left in it. Hannah stopped in the doorway a long moment, one hand resting on the frame, and I watched something complicated move across her face. Somebody planned for a baby in this house once, she said. And it never happened, or it happened and then this room just got left behind when everybody else moved on with their lives. You don't know that. No, she admitted. But it's hard not to think about it, standing here. You're not leaving anything behind, I said. Whatever else happens with Derek, whatever else happens with any of it. That baby's got a mother who drove out here in a storm instead of calling in sick to a job she didn't have to prove anything to. That's not a story about somebody getting left behind. She didn't answer right away, just ran her thumb along the edge of the crib frame like she was memorizing the shape of it. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were wet, though she blinked it back fast, the way a woman does when she's spent years teaching herself not to let people watch her cry. You say things like that too easily, she said. It's disorienting. I mean them too easily. That's probably why. We went back downstairs after that, and I made a point of finding lighter things to talk about while we sorted the pantry, because there's only so much a person can carry in one afternoon, and Hannah had already been carrying plenty before the storm ever caught up with us. I have an OB appointment Thursday, she said quietly. I was already stressed about missing it if this ran long. Everything okay? With the baby, I mean. Fine. Normal fine. I just don't love missing appointments when I don't have a lot of margin left to reschedule. She rubbed one hand slowly over the curve of her stomach, an absent, protective motion that told me more than her words did. I don't love being somewhere I can't get help fast if something goes wrong, either. Nothing's going to go wrong, I said, and hated how much I was hoping that was true rather than knowing it. You don't know that either. No, I said again. But I know I'm not leaving you to find out alone. She looked up at that, something shifting behind her eyes, and for a second, the kitchen felt smaller than it had a minute before. Then a gust of wind rattled the window hard enough to break whatever was building between us, and she looked away first, back down at the cans on the counter. Beans it is, she said. We spent the second day doing what people do when they're waiting out weather in a house that isn't theirs. I fixed the loose porch board that had been bothering me since we'd arrived, mostly because having my hands busy kept my mind off the crossing and the storm and the fact that Hannah kept pressing her hand to her back every 20 minutes like something was bothering her that she wasn't saying out loud. She found an old radio in the study, battery-powered, and got it working long enough to catch a weather report that told us the storm had stalled over the county instead of moving through the way it was supposed to. Stalled, she repeated, staring at the radio like it had personally wronged her. Storms don't stall. They move. That's what storms do. This one apparently didn't get the memo. This is a nightmare. It's a farmhouse with a roof and beans in the cabinet. I've had worse nightmares. She threw a dish towel at me for that, which I took as a good sign, since a woman too worried to laugh wasn't a woman who threw dish towels. By the afternoon, though, something had changed in her. She'd gone quiet in a different way, sitting more than moving, one hand pressed to her lower belly with a tightness in her jaw that made my stomach drop the moment I noticed it. Hannah. I'm fine. You keep saying fine like it's a magic word that makes me stop asking. She let out a breath, long and unsteady. My back's been tight since this morning. And I've had a couple of, I don't know, tightenings. Across my whole stomach. They come, they go. I think it's Braxton Hicks. I've had them before. It's probably just stress and dehydration and sitting on a hard chair for 2 days. Probably. Probably, she agreed, but her voice wobbled on the word. I got her water, made her put her feet up on a second chair, and sat close enough that she could grab my arm again if she needed to, which she did, twice, over the next hour, her fingers tightening hard during something that passed after a minute or so and left her breathing slow and careful on the other side of it. Talk to me, she said the second time, eyes shut, jaw tight. About anything. I don't care what. So I did. I told her about growing up on my grandfather's place, about the winter the power went out for 11 days and my whole family played cards by lantern light until we knew every hand anyone could deal. I told her about the first house I ever helped clear out for this job, an old widow's place with a closet full of love letters nobody in the family wanted to read. I kept talking in a low, steady voice long after the tightness in her hand let go, because somewhere in the middle of it, I realized she wasn't gripping my arm out of fear anymore. She was just holding on. Better? I asked, once her breathing had gone even again. Better, she said, and meant it this time. That night, I gave her the couch again, and this time I didn't sit up in the kitchen chair pretending I could sleep there. I dragged a second couch cushion and a blanket into the front room and stretched out on the floor near her, close enough that if something happened, I wouldn't be 30 feet and a hallway away. You don't have to sleep on the floor, she said into the dark. I know. Ryan. I'm not leaving the room, Hannah. Argue with me about it tomorrow when you've got more energy for it. She didn't argue. After a while, in the dark, she said quietly, thank you for not treating me like I'm made of glass. And also for not pretending I'm not scared. Both true things can live in the same room, I said. That's annoyingly wise for a guy who fixes porch boards for a living. I contain multitudes. She laughed, soft and real, and it was the last thing I heard before I finally, actually slept. The third day started better. The rain had thinned to almost nothing, gray light coming through the window steadier than it had in 2 days, and when I walked the lane, the water at the crossing had dropped enough that I could see the yellow stripe of pavement beneath it again, though it was still running too fast and too deep to risk the truck. Another day, maybe less, and we'd be able to get out. Before I went out to check it, Hannah had come downstairs looking more rested than she had since we arrived, hair pulled back loose, one of my old flannel shirts thrown on over her own because the house had gone cold overnight and neither of us had thought to grab enough layers. She was standing at the kitchen window when I came back in, watching the gray light move across the yard, and she didn't turn around right away when I told her the news about the water. You're quiet, I said. I'm thinking about how strange it is that I feel safer in a house with no power than I did in my own apartment 2 months ago. She finally turned, arms crossed loose over the shirt. That should probably worry me more than it does. Why would it worry you? Because it means the problem was never really the apartment, she said. It was being alone in it. And I don't know what to do with realizing that 3 days into a hurricane with a coworker I barely knew a week ago. You knew me a year ago, I said. You just never let yourself find out what that meant. She almost smiled at that, the tired, honest kind of almost smile that had started showing up more the longer we were stuck out there. Fair. We ate the last of the good food that morning, split evenly, because neither of us wanted to admit how much better a full stomach made the whole situation feel. Hannah told me about nursing school she'd almost finished before money ran out, about a version of her life that had gone sideways more than once before Derek ever showed up to make it go sideways again. I told her about my own father, who'd left when I was young enough not to remember him clearly, and how growing up watching my mother hold a house together alone had taught me more about steady love than anything my father ever showed me by staying gone. Is that why you didn't run the other direction the second you found out I was pregnant and complicated? She asked. I didn't run because complicated isn't the same as broken, I said. You're not broken, Hannah. You're just carrying more than one person should have to carry alone. That's a different problem, and it's one I can actually help with. She looked at me a long moment after that, like she was turning the sentence over to check it for holes and not finding any. I brought the news back to Hannah, who was sitting on the porch steps with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the sky like she didn't fully trust it yet. One more day, I said. Maybe less. I can do one more day. She said it like she was convincing herself as much as me. We spent that last stretch differently than the two before it. Less waiting, more talking, the kind of talking that happens when two people have run out of small things to say and only the real things are left. She told me about her mother, who'd raised her alone and worked 2 jobs and never once let Hannah see her scared, which was, she said, both the best and worst lesson anyone ever taught her. She told me she'd wanted this baby even after the father decided he didn't, that the fear wasn't about becoming a mother, it was about becoming one alone in a town where she suddenly didn't have anywhere steady to land. You're not alone in a town, I said. You've got a sister. You've got people at work who'd help if you let them pass the polite version of yourself you hand everybody. Is that what I hand people? A polite version. Pretty much. Same one you handed me for a year until a hurricane forced the issue. She smiled at that, small and a little sad. Guess I owe the weather a thank you note. Send it care of me. I'll make sure it gets there. She looked at me a long moment, the porch light gray and even around us, rain finally slowing to something almost gentle against the roof. Why does this feel easier with you than it should? We've worked together a year and I don't think I said more than 50 real words to you before yesterday. Maybe because there was nowhere else for either of us to hide, I said. No office, no small talk, no easy exit. Just a house, a storm, and whatever's actually true. And what's actually true? I thought about lying, about giving her the safe answer, the coworker answer, the one that kept everything simple once the water went down and we drove back into town and went back to being 2 people who said drive safe in a parking lot. But something about 3 days in that old house, about the way she trusted me with the hardest parts of her life instead of the polished version she gave everyone else, made the safe answer feel like a waste of the truth. True is that I've thought more about you in the last 2 days than I have about anyone in longer than I want to admit, I said. True is that watching you scared and still steady through all of this told me more about who you are than a year of paperwork ever could. And true is that when the water goes down and we drive back into town, I don't want to go back to being the coworker who fixes your printer and says nothing else. Hannah didn't answer right away. She looked out at the yard, at the fence posts leaning tired in the wet grass, at the barn that had survived one more storm it probably shouldn't have. I have a baby coming in 9 weeks, she said quietly. I am not an easy thing to want. I didn't ask for easy. No, she said, and something in her voice had gone soft in a way I hadn't heard from her before. You really didn't. She reached over and took my hand, slow, deliberate, the same way she'd grabbed my arm during the storm, except this time there was nothing to be scared of. Just the quiet after it, and the 2 of us sitting on an old porch step, waiting out the last hours of a storm that had, against every plan either of us had made, given us something neither of us saw coming. We got the all clear the next morning. The water at the crossing had dropped to a shallow, manageable run, and by 9, I had the truck loaded and idling in the gravel lot with Hannah beside me, 3 days of dust and candle smoke on both of us, and something new sitting quiet and steady between us that hadn't been there when we drove out. Our boss met us at the office looking more relieved than either of us expected, and the story of the stranded crew made its way around town fast, the way stories do in a place that size. What didn't make its way around town, at least not right away, was the rest of it. That I drove Hannah straight from the office to her sister's place to pick up the rest of her things, because the spare room offer wasn't a storm talk offer, it was a real one. That she cried in my truck the first night she slept in an actual bed instead of a car seat, not from sadness, she told me, just from finally letting herself stop holding everything up alone. That 6 weeks later, when the father of her baby resurfaced with a phone call full of apologies he clearly didn't mean, Hannah handed me the phone without a word and let me be the one who told him, calmly, that he'd had his chance and the house was full now. Derek showed up in person once, about a month after the storm, standing on my porch in a jacket too clean for a man who hadn't called in 3 weeks, asking to talk to Hannah like he had some kind of standing to demand it. I watched her walk out onto that porch steadier than I'd ever seen her at the office, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, and tell him plainly that showing up when it was convenient didn't buy him a seat at a table he'd already walked away from twice. He looked past her at me, standing in the doorway, and asked if I thought I was some kind of hero for picking up his mess. "I'm not picking up anything," I told him. "There's no mess here. There's just a woman who decided she'd rather be alone than settle for someone who only shows up between excuses, and I'm unlucky enough that she let him stand beside her instead." He didn't have much to say after that. He left, and he didn't come back around again for a long while, and when he finally did reach out months later, it was through a lawyer instead of a doorstep, which Hannah said was, honestly, an improvement. Word got around the office eventually, the way it does in a place small enough that everybody knows everybody's truck. Wade pulled me aside one morning, arms crossed, trying and failing to look stern about it. "You know dating your coworker's a liability," he said. "Especially a pregnant one. She's not a liability, Wade. She's the best thing that Storm ever did for either of us." He grumbled something about paperwork and insurance and walked off, but the next week, he moved Hannah's desk closer to the front office without anybody asking him to, which was about as close as Wade ever came to giving his blessing. The baby came early, 4 weeks ahead of schedule, on a Tuesday night with more rain outside than either of us wanted to see again for a long while. I was the one who drove her to the hospital. I was the one standing in the room when a girl with more lungs than the storm that brought her parents together came into the world screaming loud enough to make the nurses laugh. Hannah named her Wren, after nothing in particular, she said, just a small, sturdy bird that survives weather it has no business surviving. A year later, the Whitfield farmhouse sold at auction, gutted and flipped by a company that had no idea what had happened inside those walls during 3 days nobody could plan for. I thought about buying it myself once, just to keep it, but Hannah talked me out of it. "Some houses do their job and then you let them go," she said. "It kept us alive for 3 days. That's enough. It doesn't have to keep the rest of our lives too." She was right, the way she usually is now, when she finally says what she's actually thinking instead of the polite version. We got married the spring after Wren turned 1, in her sister's backyard, nothing big, nothing that needed a hurricane to make it happen this time. Hannah wore green because she said white felt like pretending we hadn't already lived a whole life together before the ceremony even started. I stood there watching her walk toward me holding our daughter on one hip, and thought about beans from a rusted can, and a lamp that barely held its light, and a woman who grabbed my arm in the dark and never really let go after that. Some nights, when Wren's finally asleep and the house is quiet in that particular way houses get after a long day, Hannah and I still talk about those 3 nights like they belonged to some other version of us, 2 people who hadn't figured out yet what they were about to become to each other. She says she remembers the fear the clearest, the water rising over the crossing, the not knowing when help would come if we needed it. I remember the quiet more, the way a house full of strangers' old furniture somehow became the safest place either of us had been in longer than we wanted to admit. "You know the strange part," she told me once, both of us out on our own porch with Wren asleep between us in her bassinet. "I used to think being strong meant never needing anybody. 2 months sleeping in a car will teach you that lesson hard, that you can survive almost anything alone if you have to. And now I think being strong was never the problem. I was always strong enough. I just didn't know I was allowed to stop proving it to everybody, including myself." She looked over at me, porch light soft on her face, the same face that had looked so guarded that first morning climbing into my truck with a duffel bag she said was just in case. "You didn't fix that in me, Ryan. I want to be clear about that. I fixed it. But you were the first person who gave me somewhere safe enough to actually try. That's the part one think about most, more than the storm, more than the beans and the candlelight and the crossing that nearly kept us apart from the rest of our lives. Not that I saved her, because I didn't, and she'd correct anyone who said it that plainly. Just that for 3 nights, neither of us had anywhere else to be, and somewhere in that stillness, two people who'd spent a year being careful with each other finally stopped being careful and started being honest instead. People ask sometimes how we got together, two coworkers who barely spoke a real sentence to each other for a year straight. Hannah usually says, "We got trapped in a farmhouse together." And I usually add, "for 3 nights that turned into the rest of our lives." Both are true. Neither is the whole story. The whole story is that sometimes the worst weather you'll ever sit through is the thing that finally makes two people stop being careful and start being honest, and that a woman sleeping in her car 2 weeks before a storm found out, in the middle of that same storm, that she never had to be alone in it again. What would you have done, stuck in an old farmhouse for 3 nights with a pregnant coworker you barely knew, watching her hold everything together while her whole world was falling apart around her? And have you ever had a moment like that, where being trapped somewhere with no way out ended up giving you something you never knew you needed? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.